Well, hello, hello. I hope you're doing well today. It's time to move on from our work on our stitched fish and to start focusing on coral. Now, coral comes in all different shapes and sizes and patterns and colors, and it was really hard for me to choose what to focus on this month. Now, I think we're going to start out by working in layers. I had already started doing a little bit of coral on my scroll before we even started our make along, but we're going to work in layers, starting with a background lacy kind of delicate open layer. So I'm going to start with our good old fly stitch and feather stitch, and here's a quick review of how these stitches work. A few different ways, but I'm going to show you the way that I make it. Fly stitch looks a bit like a Y with a U shape at the top and a little stem at the bottom. The thing to keep in mind, you're always starting at the top of your shape. So you start out exactly the same way that you started out with fly stitch. But then instead of just taking a little straight stitch to secure your fly stitch, you immediately go into another fly stitch. So that fly stitch is attached to the first one, and then you immediately take another one and you keep going, and you can go in either direction depending on your preference. You can go back and forth, you can keep going in one direction, you can change whenever you like. And shrubs, I find that shrubs and vines are really effective if you randomly alternate directions. So instead of going one way and then the other way, one, just have a really random sequence and just really randomly decide when you're going to move the legs of your stitch over into another direction. And it turns out that this is an excellent fish or an excellent stitch to create a very open, lacy, coral like effect. So that's where we're going to start. Now, if you're just joining us, I know that we've got some new people who are just joining us. Don't feel that you need to go back and add in a bunch of fish into your place. You can just start out with making lots of coral and add fish as you like. And that goes for the people who've added fish. You can always go back and forth. Although we're working on coral this month, anytime you feel like you'd like to add some fish in, please feel free to layer some fish in here. So I'm working in this area right by this big beige fish that I have, and I'm adding some feather stitch, and I'm just going back and forth layering these stitches. They're not pretty, they're not pristine, they're kind of messy, and sometimes they overlap, and I go back and forth between fly stitch and feather stitch quite regularly, just filling in an area with the stitches, and I'm overlapping them. I'm using this variegated orange thread that kind of goes between a very bright orange that shows up quite nicely on my dark green fabric here, but it also blends out to kind of a lighter pastel peach color, which is going to not show up very well against this color, that beige color of the fish. I'm going to keep the beige parts of the thread well away from my fish there, and I'm going to use it sort of further away so it doesn't blend in with the fish. So you can see how I'm working on top of each other, and the stitches are not evenly lined up. They angle off in different directions, and that gives a more natural organic look than a very straight, rigid, manufactured look, if you will. And I started at the top here, near the top, and I'm just working in this area, and I'm stopping when I get to the fish. So what I want to happen here is I want it to look like this fish is swimming in front of the coral. So if the fish is swimming in front of the coral, you would not see what was going on behind the fish. So I'm going to stop when I get to the fish, and that will give the impression that the coral continues on down but behind the fish. It'll eventually have a connection with the ground. I'll eventually do some work below the fish, but right now I'm just filling in this area above the fish. Again, working back and forth, filling in areas, and you can have open spaces and more densely stitched spaces because that's the way natural things look. They're not evenly spaced out, everything's kind of random and chaotic. And by layering stitch on top of each other, I'm starting to give that impression of depth where things move into the background and then there's stuff layered on top. And when I feel like I've finished working in that top area, I'll move down to the bottom, and then more of the same stitches, the fly stitch and the feather stitch, I will continue working down towards the bottom of my cloth here, so that I give the appearance that this coral, this piece of coral, connects to the bottom, that it's not floating in space. And again, just like I did above the fish, I will overlap and add more depth and layers and layers. And this gives the impression, it gives the illusion that that coral continues behind the fish, but I didn't have to stitch all of that coral that's behind the fish. So there it is. So now you can see that the fish looks like it's swimming in front of the coral. Now I'm going to do something interesting here. I'm going to take a few stitches on top of the fish that connect to that coral at the bottom, and that will again add more depth, because what that looks like is that the fish is swimming through the coral rather than being right in front of the coral. There's a little bit of that coral growing up in front of the fish, and so it gives the illusion that it's swimming through. And now this is a really interesting thing, because if there are parts of your fish or your background that you're not crazy about, you can start to modify those and add something in front so that it'll distract the viewer from what's going on behind whatever it is you don't like. And I've got one little clump of coral there, lacy open coral, and now I'm going to add a little bit more. And this is a really good color. This bright orange color is really good against the dark background that I have here, but it would also work really well against a light background. When you're thinking about which cloth or which color thread to add, that's keeping contrast in mind, something that's very different from the background. So as I mentioned, the orange shows up against the dark green. It also shows up against the beige, but the variegated part of the thread where it blends down to a pale peach is not going to show up against the color of the fish. It would show up against the background, so I want to make sure that when I get to that part of the thread that I'm working in an area that's far away, that's not right up against the fish, because I don't want that coral to get lost there. And I'll just keep going and adding and adding and adding, and as you've discovered, no doubt, this is not fast. And it's actually kind of nice to be able to add some cloth to help out in some of the areas, to fill in some areas, but we'll do that in an upcoming video. But for now, it's nice to be able to add some open lacy areas with just stitch. And you'll notice here, I'm just using the stitches that are already there to anchor my fly stitches. And you can do that because we're not looking for any sort of repeating pattern. So adding those little branches this way is a nice organic way to work. And I'll just keep going until I run out of thread. And now let's look at another way to add a lacy background with actual lace. So I've cut out a piece off this lace here, and I think it has a really nice open coral-like effect. It's quite interesting, especially if I use the parts that are more open and less solid. And I'm just going to work with a single strand of regular sewing thread because I don't necessarily want these stitches that I'm using here to attach the lace to show up. And I'm just going to use a combination of an overcast stitch around and around and around and a running stitch to attach the lace. But I have to make sure that I take a good bite into the lace because the very outside edges of this lace are not very stable, and if I sew just at the edge, things could easily come apart and come unravel. So I'm going to sew well into the cloth and take fairly big stitches, and it doesn't matter because the white thread will just look like part off the coral, and it doesn't have to look precise and perfect. You want it to be kind of random. And I'll just work my way around the lace until this is reasonably well secured. We'll add more stitching afterwards, but for now I just want it to be held in place so it's not going to fall off, and that'll make our decorative stitching on a little easier. Now, of course, you don't have to add more stitches. If you like the way that your lace looks on your piece, you can always just sew it on and then leave it as it is. But I have this idea to add more stitches after I sew the lace on. And now you may be thinking it's all very well and good because I've got a dark background to add this light colored lace, but what if you have a light colored background? A lot of lace comes in light colors, so how do you deal with that? Well, I'll show you that in a little bit after I finish with this piece. I'll show you a different way that you can work with lace, but let me just show you this part first, and then we'll get to that part. And I'm almost finished going all the way around. And then we'll see what happens next. So my cloth that I'm working with has these really intensely bright colored areas, which actually, funnily enough, those areas kind of reminded me of coral when I started out, but what I'm finding out is that color is so bright and intense that it's really hard to work with. So one of the things that I think I'm going to do is I'm going to cover up some of those areas with some of this white lace to de-emphasize them a little bit. I think that it would be interesting to extend this coral, give it a more of a lacy edge so it's not such a solid block, by adding our friends, the fly stitch and the feather stitch. So not over the whole thing, although I guess I could. I'm just going to add a little bit here and there so it looks like there's more going on than just a solid chunk there. And one of the things that I'm going to make sure that I do when I'm adding these stitches is I'm not going to end them just right at the edge of the lace. I'm going to continue those stitches well into the lace. They won't be very obvious, but if I stop right at the edge, it can look a little bit like the two pieces are separate, like they're not connected. But by continuing the stitching into the lace, well into the lace, it creates more of a connection between the two pieces. And I think this looks quite good. It's quite a coral looking addition. And this is part of the thing. You can imagine how long it would take, how much longer it would take to stitch this whole area. And you certainly could. You could do the whole thing with stitch, but by using the lace, it saves a lot of time. And I get a good bang for my buck there. And with just a few stitches added to the outside, it really creates an interesting texture. So I'm really enjoying the way that that turned out. And like I said, I'm going to use this in quite a few different places on my piece. Lace often comes in quite pale light colors, and if you've got some dark colored lace, that's great. But if you don't and you've got a light colored background, here's a way that you can modify the color of your lace to show up more against your background. Now I'm using just some cheap acrylic craft paint that I bought at the dollar store, and yep, that's right, I'm using lots of water and I'm just painting it. So acrylic paint is basically plastic, and as you see here, I don't wash my palette every time, because every time you wash acrylic paint down the drain, it's going into the waterway, so I just let it dry on my palette here. Yes, you can paint lace or any fabric with acrylic paint. I wouldn't actually recommend fabric paint. A lot of fabric paint is designed to work with cotton or natural fibers. It won't necessarily stick to lace, but acrylic paint will stick to it quite well. And I used a lot of water, so I'm hoping it's not going to change the texture very much. And here's what it looked like when I cut that lace out. And my paint did make it a little bit stiffer, but I'm not actually sewing into the lace. So you can paint your lace if you want to change the color. And now it turns out, here's another stitch. There's actually a stitch called the coral stitch, and I'm going to give it a try. I've never actually done this stitch before, but I watched a couple of YouTube videos, and now I'm an expert. Isn't that the way it works? Well, let's see how this goes. And I think I want this stitch to be fairly bold, so I'm actually going to use 4 strands of the embroidery thread. I don't usually use 4 strands, it's quite chunky, but I think for this stitch that it actually will need these 4 strands. And this creates a rather interesting looking stitch. Now, if you do it in a very regular manner, it doesn't really look like coral, but I think that I can modify it to look like coral. So let's see how this works. Now, the way the stitch works is you take one back stitch. You just take one stitch and then you go back, but you don't go back very far. The back part is quite small, and then you slide your needle just underneath the stitch, not through the cloth, just underneath the stitch, and then you go through the loop that's formed, and that creates a bit of a knot. And now then you take another stitch and then back a little ways. So when you do the little back stitch, you're still hovering around the end of your straight stitch, and then you go underneath your thread, and you can wrap it around 2 or 3 times if you like to make a bigger knot, and you go through the loop to create the coral stitch. Now, I don't know if I'm doing this exactly right. It looks a little bit wonky, but I think that's okay. That's giving a very coral-like appearance. So if you'd like a better tutorial, if you search YouTube for coral stitch, I'm sure you will be able to find a tutorial from somebody who's much better at creating the stitch than I am. But I'm calling this a win because I think that this is actually looking quite effective for a different sort of branched coral-like thing, imperfect coral, because that's the name of my game anyways, making things look imperfect. So you just keep going. You take a stitch and you just move slightly backwards, and then you come up near the end of the stitch, and then you basically make a French knot around your stitch. And now I'm just kind of randomly moving around and just creating branches with these little nubbly knots. And you can also, if you like, just add some random French knots in here. We've talked about French knots before, but I don't think I'm going to do a tutorial on French knots right now. I will do it in a future upcoming video when we're using it more. And you can keep going as long as you like. And the more lumpy and kind of random and imperfect this looks, the more I think it looks actually like natural coral. So keep going if you want to do this. You don't have to. If it's very confusing to you and you don't want to do this stitch, then you absolutely don't have to. But I think that as I'm doing this, perhaps if I practice more, perhaps I would be better at doing this. Perhaps it wasn't the best idea to do the stitch for the very first time on camera for this video, but I'm going to call this kind of a win because I actually, although I'm not sure I'm doing the stitch right, I actually like the way it's looking. So if you want to give this stitch a try, by all means, give it a go and see how it works for you. So this video is getting quite long, and I've got a couple of other things that I'd like to show you. But for now, let's finish off this section and see what it looks like when it gets done. And how do I know when to stop? Well, basically when I run out of thread. And I don't know how I decide. Sometimes I look at the thread and think, oh, okay, I'm just going to pull off a short length and see what happens, and then I'll be done. And then other times I pull off a longer length. So this time it had quite a long length, but I'm kind of enjoying the way this is looking. And I'm getting near the end of my thread here. It's getting a little bit fiddly, so I think this is going to be time to pull it off. Oh, let's see, one more. Can I get one more out of this? Oh, I'm getting close to the end bit here. Let's see what happens. Oh, I managed to get one more. Oh, no, there, look. Came unthreaded. Let's see. I think I should be just calling this a day. There, I got to the back. That's it. No more. Stop now. I think that looks quite convincing as coral. Anyway, that is it for this video. There'll be another one coming shortly with a few other stitches that you can work on to create your first layer of coral.